Hello and welcome. Occidental's Young Initiative on Global Political Economy was pleased to host Professor Kelly Zvobgo from William & Mary's Justice Lab. What follows are highlights from Professor Zvobgo's talk, in which she shared her cutting-edge research on transitional justice and truth commissions and argued for the urgent relevance of truth commissions to creating more just, peaceful societies in states of all sorts, including in established democracies. Enjoy Professor Zvobgo's talk. Let me just start by introducing Kelly, who's just magnificent and really impressive. First thing to say is she's finished up her PhD at USC, so at a neighboring institution, which is one of the reasons why we've connected before. But she's also already the head of, and in fact, founder of the International Justice Lab at William & Mary in Virginia. And she'll be joining William & Mary as an assistant professor starting next year, if I understand correctly, Kelly. Correct me if I'm wrong. But that's her institutional affiliations. What's most important to say is obviously a young scholar, but just cutting edge on a number of different issues. Those in my class will know that we actually have a reading from Kelly on a distinct topic in terms of human rights in the World Bank a bit later in the semester. That's one element of her research. And in fact, the reason I first connected to Kelly was because that particular paper won the award for best human rights paper a few years ago at the International Studies Association. She also works on race and international relations, or maybe doesn't work on, but has contributed a significant commentary on that particular topic. And more than anything else, she works on transitional justice. And as you can see from the slide that's up, truth commissions and transitional justice have been a focal point of Kelly's research. And I will now turn it over to Kelly to talk about that. Kelly.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me again. It's always great to be at Occidental, a place that I'm familiar with. I'm from Southern California originally. I grew up in Claremont. I have friends who went to Oxy. I have fantastic colleagues who go there. And I've had the pleasure of engaging perhaps some of you, certainly some of your classmates, a couple of years ago when I was discussing some related research on quasi-judicial bodies in human rights. And so today I'll be continuing in that spirit, but this time talking about one type of quasi-judicial body called a truth commission. You might have heard related names or overlapping names like Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Historical Clarification Commission, Truth and Dignity Commission. In Timor-Leste, there was the Commission for Reception, Truth and Reconciliation. But generally, we call these sets of institutions truth commissions. And I'll talk a little bit more about what distinguishes them from other types of government inquiries and how they fit into transitional justice. So in terms of transitional justice, or TJ, as I like to call it, you save a lot of time by producing acronyms. So it is a set of judicial and non-judicial measures to address human rights. Typically, TJ is provided by the state, that is national governments. They are the ones who are duty-born under international law to provide transitional justice as a response to human rights abuses. And TJ has 4 pillars: truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-recurrence, which in many contexts has been operationalized as institutional reform. And so these were developed between the Second World War and the mid to late 1990s as the international community felt an urgent need to address, at that time, violence between states, interstate conflict. And so you have the Nuremberg and the Tokyo tribunals, which were led primarily by the winners of the war, which sought to bring justice for a range of atrocity crimes during the Second World War. Criticized by some as victor's justice, but certainly landmark institutions in the development of global transitional justice and in the underlining of a norm of restitution and accountability for harm. Now, as we went on into the Cold War and internal armed conflicts emerged all around the globe, there were a different set of remedies, an additional set of remedies that were introduced to address these harms. Not only tribunals, whether those were done at the international level or at the domestic level, but also non-retributive truth-seeking processes, hence truth commissions. But while I'm still on the subject of judicial measures, we have during this period the development of case law in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and the European Court of Human Rights, where the 4 pillars of transitional justice are defined, promulgated into law. These were rights of victims, primarily victims or the families of victims of forced disappearances. And so if you brought a case to the Inter-American Court having exhausted domestic channels, because Inter-American Court is a court of last resort, as are most regional international courts, you were entitled to receive from the state knowledge of what happened to your family member, justice. So generally criminal prosecutions and sentencing of perpetrators, reparations, typically in the form of monetary compensation, and institutional reform. So it was incumbent on states, formerly rights-violating states, to provide these remedies. But as I have underlined and bolded and italicized, these were meant to be individual remedies, so that if something happened to me or to a family member, that I would go and avail myself of justice from the state. However, with what we call a justice boon in the 90s, with the development of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the development of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court and its ratification, truth commissions like those we saw in South Africa and other places, transitional justice, these 4 pillars were expanded to be a comprehensive framework for states as a whole that were exiting periods of repression, whether that was internal armed conflict between a government and an armed opposition, or if it was a period of just government abuses against the civilian population, or even transitions from autocracy to democracy. Now, truth commissions, which forms the basis of much of my work, are temporary bodies authorized by the government to investigate political violence over a period of time and to establish a pattern of violence while engaging with the affected population. And so these fit under that first pillar, truth, because they are historical inquiries into political violence. They are intended to establish an authoritative account on the past and to provide a framework for governments to address past harm and to safeguard against future harm, right? You can't go forward if you don't address what's behind you. Now, I like truth commissions for lots of reasons, some of which I will talk to you about today, and others that I'll be happy to elaborate on in the question and answer period. But one thing that's quite significant about these bodies is that they are uniquely positioned among transitional justice institutions to actually support further transitional justice. And so a truth commission in its report provides truth to families, to communities, so that there is knowledge of what happened in the past. But they also issue recommendations about reparations, about trials, about a range of institutional reforms. And so they can actually set up other transitional justice mechanisms on an evidence-based path. And they are notable as well because they, unlike judicial measures, for example, if you have an individual prosecuted, convicted, and sentenced, that doesn't really help you address institutional reforms because that was a personalized or an individualized form of justice. And so in terms of being far-reaching, truth commissions are able to do that in terms of reaching into the past as they establish a pattern of abuses over time, and also as they reach into the future, as they provide and policy frameworks for governments exiting violence. Now, right now, I am working on a book project called Governing Truth, NGOs, and the Politics of Transitional Justice. This has been a labor of love and a little bit of pain, but it's really a piece of work that I'm really proud of, and that I'm excited to be revising and submitting for review in the next couple of years. And I ask in this project, why do some governments, but not others, adopt transitional justice institutions, design them to succeed, and follow up on them with particular policies, right? So basically, why TJ? And if these seem, I guess, maybe like fundamental questions or basic questions, they just haven't been asked and answered, which is regrettable, because these bodies have proliferated over the globe since the Second World War. Like I said, and truth commissions in particular, there have been 84 commissions in 63 countries from 1970 to 2018. And so we really should be investigating them in greater detail. And so in the book project, I propose that each of these outcomes, institutional adoption, strong institutional design, and institutional delivery and follow-up, these are all the product of the advocacy, the technical expertise, and the operational assistance of civil society organizations, specifically NGOs, all around the world. And so we are able to make sense of the norm and practice of transitional justice. And I take as my point of departure, of course, truth commissions, because if you're going to do a cross-national study and do fieldwork and all these things, it's really wise to go mechanism by mechanism, especially where we find ourselves in transitional justice research, where we had really big survey studies that would talk about there was a truth commission here, and there were these trials, and there was a reparations program. So we had a lot of breadth of understanding, but less so depth of understanding. And so for this project, I, together with some students at USC and here at William & Mary, collected a lot of data. We built together 4 data sets that established the universe of truth commissions. And so we didn't have a comprehensive list of how many truth commissions there had been, period, or a comprehensive one anyway. Some estimates were 40. We actually found 84 in a multiplicity of contexts in 63 countries. We also investigated, collected data on encoded from laws and from presidential decrees, etc., into spreadsheets to be the basis of our quantitative data sets. The design of truth commissions. So we looked at what powers they have, what they're allowed to investigate, what they're not allowed to investigate, how much time they have to work. Can they subpoena individuals or compel other material evidence? Can they work with courts? Can they not work with courts, et cetera? So we could better understand their inner functionings. So that helps us, first we are able to answer the question of why do some governments adopt truth commissions, because we now know the universe of commissions. And so we can look at every place that had a transition and see whether or not it implemented a truth commission. And then in terms of designing for success, some of the powers that I've mentioned already, subpoena powers, evidence preservation powers, ability to work with courts, et cetera, these all set up a commission for success. And where governments don't, their mechanisms are vulnerable to not being able to accomplish their missions. And finally, to address this last point about following up with particular policies, we built a data set of 5,710 recommendations. So the universe of recommendations made by truth commissions around the world as a response to what they have studied, right? So that's a lot, because we went from 84 truth commissions, right? But 5,710 recommendations. And so with these data, I describe essentially what commissions have recommended over time, and also what governments have implemented. And for this last part of implementation, I focus on Guatemala, South Africa, and Timor-Leste, which are said to have had very strong Truth Commission processes and are places where there has been strong civil society, but we haven't been able to really connect the two in terms of how civil society was able to use the products of the Truth Commission, that is the report, to advocate for more transitional justice. And so I evaluate in this last part of the book what recommendations have been implemented and which ones have not been. And I'm happy to go into more detail in the Q&A. 15 minutes is fast. All right, and in related work, because we have these great data, we're now able to exploit variation within a single institution across countries. And so with my colleague, Daniel Solomon at Georgetown, we have a paper that's under review called Co-opting Truth, Explaining Quasi-Judicial Institutions in Authoritarian Regimes. And so we're able to actually use from the data that I built with my students at USC and here at William & Mary, we're able to appreciate, to comprehend for the first time that 1/3 of global truth commissions have been implemented under authoritarian regimes. And instead of just throwing these out because, oh, well, obviously they're not going to advance human rights, we actually wanted to study them and to study them seriously. Just like we study courts in different countries with different regime types, so too should we study truth commissions and see what are the politics that cause them to emerge, how are they designed, how do they operate, and what are their outcomes. And in this paper, we do kind of like a survey of autocratic truth commissions around the world and focus on two in particular in Uganda by Idi Amin and Yoweri Museveni, who created respectively self-investigating and rival investigating commissions. And so the self-investigating commission, we theorize and we find evidence that it's designed to put the leader in a better light by diminishing responsibility, by obfuscating, but by appearing to do something while not doing very much. Meanwhile, rival investigating commissions under autocracies are actually quite serious. They produce very comprehensive reports. But it's not just for the love of transitional justice and for human rights. It's to decrease the power of political rivals. It's to make them unrealistic rivals. So it diminishes their power and strengthens the power of the incumbent. And so we're able to learn a lot by taking different types of commissions within the universe of commissions seriously. And finally, I'm working with two of my former students at USC on a project called Confronting Truth, Investigating Transitional Justice in Established Democracies, where we begin by studying truth commissions in Canada and in the United States, what some might consider unlikely candidates for transitional justice because they have not had your standard period of repression, although definitely happy to have an internal critique of that. But they are non-ideal typical cases for transitional justice. And so we're curious about why they emerge, when they do, what they're able to uncover, and what important outcomes they lead to. I will close there. Gosh, time went by so quickly, but I look forward to engaging your questions, your comments, happy to talk about any and all of these projects and yet others still, and of course, more generally about transitional justice. Thank you.
Yay. Thanks a ton, Kelly. I really, really appreciate that swift whirlwind of an overview of your work, which is so interesting and so comprehensive. So great. So now we're full screen so we can see people. So basically, as I mentioned, just love to get your questions. And Kelly's been kind enough to say she's happy to stick around, answer those all. Put them into the chat box, raise your hand, raise your voice, however you'd like to do that. Professor Ear, same if you have a question and or your students have questions, feel free to lead things off. But wonderful.
Yeah. No, I actually would love to. It's a fantastic talk, by the way. I mean, really gave us a bird's eye view of your research. I'm always reminded of Michael Ignateff's quip that truth commissions are about narrowing the scope of permissible lies, not about actually getting at the truth. And I think about, Cambodia, where I'm originally from, and the tribunal that they chose to have, which of course is all about prosecution and, finding people guilty, when in fact what they'll say then is, I'm not guilty. I did not do anything. They made me do it. I don't know anything. So there's always that regret that a truth commission would have been better. But of course, that's not what the government wanted. That's not what the agreement with the UN ended up being. And so it's just fascinating, especially that contrast. But of course, the focus of today is more towards the Truth Commission side of the equation. So
thanks for that intervention. So I really appreciate the example of Cambodia, because it shows you that actually truth commissions are hard. So there's been such an emphasis on judicialization and on courts and international relations that, sometimes truth commissions, it's what you get when you can't get real justice, right? But actually, transitional justice, like I said, is those four things: truth, justice, reparations, guarantees of non-recurrence. And they're actually designed to be complementary institutions, right? So you have prosecutions maybe for a small number of perpetrators, because realistically, after a civil war has ended and there were thousands of soldiers, you're not going to dedicate your entire judicial system to addressing crimes for those individuals. And if you did, you might not even have gotten peace in the first place, right? Sometimes there are deals that must be made to make the peace, to end the violence. And so you have some prosecutions, and you have a truth commission to really show you the arc of history, and not just to establish incidents of abuse by specific people at specific times for specific reasons, which is how trials work, and with a very high evidentiary basis, but to really understand the history in total, and to understand the political, economic, social, and cultural antecedents of that violence. Truth commissions are about understanding not only what happened, but why it happened, with a view to preventing similar types of violence and abuse from happening again in the future. And so they are really quite comprehensive. So yeah, thanks for that. The hill that I will die on is that truth commissions matter. We should be taking them more seriously. That means in my field that I had to, bring lots and lots of quantitative data to really provide evidence of this, not only the single N or the small N research, qualitative research that we've had in the past, and to show that they're actually really costly. Even for Idi Amin, who created an investigation to diminish responsibility, to paint himself in a better light, that report in the commission ran away from him a bit, to the point where the report was not published officially ever. It was leaked. And even he, the autocrat who created a commission to, have a rose-colored glasses perspective on him, there were parts of the history that he even was not able to revise. And so going back to the Michael Ignatieff quote, transitional justice or truth commissions is about reducing the number of lies that can be told in the public square with impunity, right? And so it's not perfect, right? But it can't be, because of the circumstances from which it arises, but it's a bite of the apple. It's trying to provide restitution in the best way that states can after periods of profound violence.
Yeah, and I think it's trying to get us closer to that positive peace, right? To get that the deep-rooted, the root cause of why the conflict began in the first place.
Exactly right.
Well, there's a couple of questions in the chat. Maybe I'll just ask Sarah and Lena to state your questions one after the other, and then you can take them both on. And actually, Jonathan as an addendum to one of the questions. But Sarah Cook, you want to state your question for Kelly?
Yeah, I just wanted to hear more about what you said at the end about the idea of Canada and America not having like a repressive history, especially when it comes to Indigenous and First Nations people and, Aboriginal people, Black people. I'd just like to hear you speak on that a little bit. And I think that, ties into Lena's question too.
Yeah. So
let me get Lena's question in there as well, because I think it's connected, and then maybe you can, if as you like. But Lena, why don't you throw your question in there as well, and then Kelly, turn it back over to you. How's that?
Yeah, I was just curious if you thought that, I mean, it's basically just what I wrote, whether you think that in our current moment, the U.S. could benefit from a truth commission. There's a lot of kind of directions you could take that, either in terms of systemic racism over a long period, or the U.S.'s settler colonialism, or also even just like in the period about the period of Donald Trump. Just do with that what you will.
Yeah. Okay. So part of the first question is a little bit above my pay grade because I'm not a peace and conflict studies scholar, but I do think we are being challenged this year and just, in recent years to conceptualize or to reconceptualize repression and how we measure it, right? If you look at this year in terms of the violence against protesters, for example, who are protesting state-sponsored violence, state-executed condoned violence against Black and brown folks in this country, maybe by the end of this year, we'll have what PRIO, the Peace Research Institute Oslo, calls 25 battle-related deaths, right? If we were to consider these skirmishes or these scuffles, if anyone dies in the process, 25 is the threshold for an internal armed conflict, according to these data. Now, is the U.S. going to become an observation, the 2020 data? I don't know. Likewise, with just democracy data in general, some folks, I like to just wade in data that's not mine, just to see what's going on, poking around. And actually, for the first time since 1973, the U.S. is an 8 on the polity score. So it's actually reverted from a 10, which is the highest level, because of factionalism and how strong it has become because of polarization, and also things related to disenfranchisement, in particular of people of color. And so, I mean, it's tricky because the data that we use to analyze these types of institutions and where we expect to see them, capture them so that we can even establish a base universe of would-be cases. For example, in the first part of my project, in the article that you read, I asked, why are commissions adopted in some places and not in others? And so to identify the universe of candidates, I look at countries that exited internal armed conflict, autocracy, and a period of government killings of civilians. Now, if the U.S. is not being captured in either of these data sets, it's not somewhere from where we can predict that this type of body will happen. And so there are some conceptual and measurement issues in IR that I think we should be taking seriously, that we should not be so Eurocentric and so, self-congratulatory to think that we shouldn't be counted in ways that would, classify us as having these different types of violence, and to which TJ should respond. Okay, I think I give myself like a C plus B minus on that first part of the answer. Okay, now it's something that we're puzzling over right now, and I don't control the Civil War data, but I think maybe, or internal armed conflict more technically, but I think that this should count, but. I don't produce those data, and so I can't decide what goes in and what goes out. But I can talk about transitional justice and prospects for transitional justice in the U.S. Now, Canada has had 2 national commissions. The first was in 2009, so the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Canada, which was investigating abuses in the Indian residential school system for over 140-year period, right up until 1996. That's fairly recent. And wouldn't, this particular practice wouldn't appear in some of these data sets because it's not, killings. There's such a focus on killings when repression takes so many different forms. And so there was an inquiry, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, followed up recently. The commission just finished in 2019 with the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, which is also a problem here in the United States. And so that inquiry was focused on that particular question. In the US, we had a commission in the 80s, the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Citizens, CWRIC, which looked at the relocation and internment of persons of Japanese ancestry during the Second World War, a process that produced acknowledgement that led to reparations, though delayed, and a national apology and the development of educational curriculum to cover this period. So those are kind of the two types of national commissions we've had on this side of the Atlantic. Other countries in Europe have also had similar inquiries. As you can tell, countries have a hard time addressing the full range of their abuses. So in Canada, you have two commissions focusing on children and focusing on women, but for very specific types of abuses over a certain period of time. In the US, it was one ethnic minority group during a very limited window of time, which was the Second World War. Now, there are calls for national commissions. There has been a call for a National Truth and Healing Commission by Congresswoman Barbara Lee that is currently being deliberated, or it's on pause, but was introduced earlier this summer in June. And so that would be a national commission that kind of spans American history and with a focus on African Americans and their experiences of state repression over 4 centuries. But and this is actually somewhere where I'm going next in terms of my work, I'm interested in challenging the idea of truth commissions and transitional justice being delivered by states. Of course, they have to be delivered by countries. They're the ones who are bound or obligated to provide TJ under international law. But in such large countries like Canada and the US, I'm interested in what provincial governments can do and what state governments can do, because we have seen some initiatives at the state level in both Canada and the US. So in the US, there was a Truth Commission in Maine, which was joint between the state government of Maine and the Wabanaki people to investigate essentially a policy of family separation where Indigenous Wabanaki children were taken from their parents because it was deemed by the state that they were not adequate custodians of their children. And so they were put into the foster care system at a rate of 5 or 6 times more than any other group. And there was, lots of bias that went into this. It wasn't really based on reality. And so there's this really painful history. Maryland has created a truth commission to investigate racial terror lynchings in the state from 1854 to 1933. I actually consulted the commission last summer. They were going to get going in 2020, but then COVID happened, so that they're doing the historical component and not having hearings because it's not safe to do so. But that is happening as well. And lots of initiatives at the city level and lots of proposals this summer for Philadelphia, Boston, San Francisco. Iowa City just started its mechanism like last week. And so there's a lot of potential for having transitional justice being delivered at different levels of government. So we don't necessarily have to rely on national governments to do it, especially when the history and the issues are so vast and are so diverse and indeed have a regional component, right? A lynchings commission wouldn't make sense in, let's say, Southern California or in the state of California, but something relating to treatment of migrant workers, might make more sense there. And so there is a lot of possibility. I wrote an article in the Washington Post that talks about this. Feel free to look it up. We kind of engage the trade-offs between breadth, so knowing a lot over a long period of time, and depth. And so do we want a national commission? Is that the most desirable outcome? Or would city and state level commissions be better, right? And should we be talking about every single possible type of abuse that's happened to folks of color, let's say, in this country, or maybe focus on police killings? Lots of trade-offs in any of these cases.
So let me, first of all, just a quick question, follow-up question from Sarah, which I think is just a quick point of clarification. What scale did you say that was on? You referred to a scale earlier in your initial comments in response to her question. And she was curious what scale you were referring to, I believe. Is that correct, Sarah?
Yeah, you just said something about America being 10 on a scale and it now dropping back.
Yeah, that was the polity. That is the polity 2 variable. So there's the polity project, which essentially encodes regime type for every country, basically since like 1800 or something like that, on a scale. For this particular variable, it's called the polity 2 variable, -10 to 10, -10 being the strongest autocracies, +10 being the strongest democracies. We have been at 10 for a lot of our history, and we dipped to an 8 in the 70s, circa Nixon, and then we're a 10 again, and actually since 2016, I believe, have been back to an 8, which is curious. So we have regressed and may regress yet further. But, even that 8, I think that might be quite generous, because pre-2016 we were a 10, yet I believe it's 2 of the past 5 presidential elections have been won by the person who did not get the popular vote. So even how we define democracy in the ways that, and how we build our data, is not necessarily built on reality. And so I think there's something to be said about not a conflict of interest, but maybe working with more global South scholars or what have you, because right now a lot of these data sets on conflict, on democracy, et cetera, are created by academics in colleges and universities in the global north. And I think in a way that can kind of make us a bit myopic to the reality, right? The US theoretically should never have been a 10. Certainly not before 1920. Also not before 1964, 65, right? And so how we conceptualize what it even means to be a democracy, I think should be contested and critiqued more. And we should have measures that reflect at least the uncertainty that maybe for some people, the US has been a 10, for the last 100 plus years, but for others, it really has not.
And who determines that? Who gets to?
So the Polity Project is a research project. I'm forgetting. It's a multi-institutional data project. And so it is academics and practitioners who essentially they solicit questionnaires from country experts. Same thing with the Varieties of Democracy Project, which is a little bit better than Polity, actually. And so they get expert input and they build these metrics. But the underlying concepts may not reflect, certainly democracy for minoritized populations, whether they are statistically minorities or not. It's more about how they are treated. Likewise, the Peace Research Institute Oslo is a consortium, engages a consortium of universities, of academics, political scientists, essentially counting through various forms of data, news reports, UN documents, et cetera, to ascertain the number of killings, the sides in conflict. Sometimes it's the government versus an armed rebel group. Sometimes it's rebel groups against each other. Sometimes, it's multiple groups. They're all fighting each other, and essentially how many casualties relate, how many casualties, specifically fatalities, are produced. And so, it's a lot of professors basically building these data. So surprise, surprise, that we might be wrong about some things.
Thank you.
Never wrong, Kelly. Absolutely not.
Do you mind spelling?
Behind the curtain, my bad, sorry.
Do you mind spelling that for me, the Polity Project?
So it's Polity. So just like the Polity 4 project, I think we might be getting to Polity 5 this year. But it's basically, it's the Systemic Peace Project. So any one of these names should get you to that resource. But I quite like the Varieties of Democracy Project. It definitely engages different types. So there'll be just electoral democracy, which is, which is procedural, right? Which can be different from liberal democracy, which is more substantive. So VDEM is doing a good job of, at least engaging how you might be a democracy in procedural ways, but not in substantive ways. And even here, voter suppression, are we really at the highest levels of electoral democracy? Is the franchise being made available to all, without state interference? Big question mark there.
Nicole had a question. Nicole, do you want to state your question?
Yeah, sure. Also, thank you so much for coming to talk to us. It's actually really funny because I was explaining transitional justice to my mom, I think this morning, and I couldn't find a way to properly explain it to her. And I literally wrote down what you said in hopes of giving that to her later and being okay, now do you understand what I'm talking about?
You got it.
But my question sort of diverges slightly from what we were discussing earlier. Do you think truth commissions take into account or at least acknowledge the blurring of an identity of victim and perpetrator in internal armed conflicts? I'm thinking mostly in reference to Colombia, which, as Professor Chase knows, I've researched a lot, and him and I both being Colombians, we find the topic very interesting. Yeah. You know, since it is our home, and the fact that at times, in a certain light, one person can be viewed as a victim, but then from another angle, they're viewed as a perpetrator. So I'm just wondering, how do truth commissions take that into account?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I haven't studied this systematically, but one thing about truth commissions, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, is that they're able to kind of engage the complexity of a conflict, right? And to, like, let's think about transitional justice. I use this language a lot of performance. And performance does not have to be bad, but just think of it as something that is being conducted, that's supposed to be watched, and there's engagement between the audience and the participants, right? And so whereas prosecutions typecast, right? So let's say we're talking about casting roles, that there has to be, you know, this victim and there has to be this perpetrator, and the goal of the process is to establish the guilt or the non-guilt of this person with reference to this person, right? And so, you know, you might have in a trial something called like diminished capacity, right? So if somebody was like, let's say, a child soldier, that maybe, you know, they should only the abuses they committed after they were 18 should be considered, or that the very fact that they were conscripted into a group as children should be considered a mitigating factor in terms of sentencing and those types of things. But prosecutions don't just really do that very well. Likewise with reparations. Reparations programs generally have very clear beneficiary lists, right? And so you have to have established, you know, that something happened to you, and sometimes there's an exclusionary rule, like you cannot have, you know, been involved in the conflict to be able to qualify for reparations. And so you have there some, I guess, inflexibility in terms of prosecutions and reparations. Truth commissions can theoretically engage both. The hearing process is that people who want to participate, be they victims, perpetrators, witnesses, or a mix thereof, are able to communicate their story on their terms, in their language, without necessarily an objective, right? In courts, it's to establish guilt or non-guilt. For reparations, it's do you qualify or do you not qualify? And so theoretically, truth commissions are able to do this. However, just because of the nature of the perceived victim-perpetrator binary, if someone's kind of on the middle or on the margins, I think there can be concerns on their part about participating in a process, right? There's always concerns that what is said in a commission, unless there's an explicit, you know, law that says what is said at a commission cannot be used against someone, or that you have amnesty or, immunity, there's the concern that what you say could be used against you. And so for people on the margins, you know, they might not want to participate. Likewise, perpetrators don't participate in many instances. I have a study actually, which drew on material from my undergraduate senior thesis at Pomona College called Designing Truth, Facilitating Perpetrator Testimony at Truth Commissions. And the greatest percentage of truth commissions to perpetrators there's ever been at a commission was in Timor-Leste, and it was about 18%. So even then, participation is still not, these are still for the most part very victim-centered mechanisms of transitional justice. Now, what the commission can do is that it can hold, for example, special hearings on, let's say, child soldiers, and to really sensitize the population to what it means that these were children that were taken from their homes and who, you know, through drugs and manipulation and fear, et cetera, were enlisted into committing abuses. Truth commissions are just about putting together the history, not so much establishing judgment against particular persons, just putting together the facts. And of course, these can become politicized, but I think commissions relative to other bodies are able to certainly to collect those testimonies and sort them as they would. But yeah, no, complex victimhood or complex perpetrator hood is something that people engaging in transitional justice everywhere definitely struggle with. I think there's the possibility of, having mitigating factors, but again, that would really be something that's more helpful for diminishing responsibility that can be punished, right? So because truth commissions aren't trying to make that judgment in the first place, it's important, but I don't think it's like a deal breaker, if that makes sense.
Well, there's two questions in the chat. Mm-hmm. One from Jonathan, which is a bit of a fragment. So Jonathan, I wanted to ask if do you feel like your question's already been answered, or if you want to elaborate on your question just a bit.
So Lena's question was about whether the U.S. could benefit, and it's kind of like a yes or no type of question. But I'm more curious as to. I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I'm just like nodding.
Okay. But my question is more, instead of like, say, assuming that, a truth commission weighing the advantages and disadvantages, if it would help, how could it, what are some more concrete consequences? Mm-hmm. How would it affect? I know that's a really complex question, and, of course it would require lots of research, but I'd just like to know your thoughts on that.
All right, let's take one slice. All right. So as I've discovered this summer on Twitter, where I spend way too much time, but also, in talking to folks that I grew up with, in reading the news, and watching the news, most people of color know and believe that systemic racism is real. A non-trivial amount, I wouldn't say it's a majority, but a sizable portion of the population that is white does not understand or believe, and certainly in our own government, many of our leaders do not believe that systemic racism either exists or is a problem or is as severe of a problem as we say that it is. So how can truth commissions help us address systemic racism? One way is to actually educate the public on what it means to have a system, right? Isabel Wilkerson just had this great book come out called Caste, right? So she actually, and just like Michelle Alexander in The New Jim Crow, uses this notion of caste and how there are just essentially parallel realities in the United States. And so when you have a population brought in chains to the United States to produce wealth for individuals and for the nation, right? And then these individuals are emancipated, but then cannot own property, cannot vote, are in many ways confined to similar manual labor that they were performing under the period of enslavement. Then you have folks leaving and going out of the rural areas into more suburban or into more urban areas, but not being allowed to live in certain places, not being able to go to school, avail themselves of public goods, like healthcare, not being able to participate in the franchise to the same extent. And then, oh yes, by the way, loitering and vagrancy laws essentially criminalize poverty to the point where people, can be incarcerated and then are again producing labor for private organizations or for the state, et cetera, all up into the present day. So I think truth commissions could kind of explain this slow roll of events and really clarify that, police brutality, for example, today is not just something that just like happened because or that we now know about because people have smartphones and can record what's happening, right? But it's all part of a system wherein Black folks in particular, but certainly, the focus of my current comments, but certainly this applies to First Peoples and also to Asian Americans, Latinx, et cetera, have just had a different version of the American state in terms of life outcomes, in terms of health outcomes, in terms of access to institutions, et cetera. So I think breaking these concepts down, because I also do feel like this summer there was this like great awakening where like so many people, a little bit in a frustrating way, but some people like realized, oh my goodness, it's so terrible because we're stuck at home, and so people are actually paying attention. And so to the extent that a Truth Commission could get people to pay attention and to have explained for them or to be taught exactly how the U.S. has been predicated on, was and is predicated on the marginalization and oppression of non-white peoples, like that would be very helpful. I don't know if a Truth Commission can accomplish that. Again, I don't know if a national commission is best poised to do that, but I think to the extent that abuses can be placed into context and mapped across our history, which is why the 1619 Project was so important, right? And kind of crystallizing these things. That's why, podcasts like Uncivil is by Gimlet is such an important resource. All of these different things are helping to connect the present to the past. Also the Throughline podcast. I listen to a lot of podcasts since COVID, but all of these, making sense of what happened, because people say so much like, oh, well, my family didn't own slaves, or that was like 200 years ago. But it's like this same system, you might not own, or you might not enslave people and benefit from their labor. But for example, the wealth gap is a direct tie-in to that history, right? And so people without necessarily participating in this type of repression absolutely benefit from it, while other people are disadvantaged in it.
Okay, so I told Kelly we tried to get at her around 5 or a little bit after. There's some great questions in the chat. So what I'm going to do is, Noah, I think your question really connects to the conversation that Kelly is just having. So I'm going to skip Archibald, but Archibald, I'm not skipping you, just to say that you and Carissa, I think, are asking very complimentary questions. So after that, maybe you both can pose your question to Kelly. And then there's a final question from Lena, which I think is a great question as well. So hopefully we have a chance to get to all those. But Noah, do you want to sort of pose your question as a follow-up to the current discussion?
Yeah, it very much. Also, yeah, thanks for being here. It's nice to, it was great to hear from you. But yeah, my question definitely ties in a lot to what you were just speaking on. Basically, I'm just trying to, it's hard for me to visualize a Truth Commission in the US where I feel like I've learned now, or like recently, that a large percentage of the population probably doesn't believe in the systemic racism that has defined the US. Or if they do acknowledge that it exists, they don't see anything wrong with it. So what would a Truth Commission on, let's say, systemic racism in the United States, what would that produce? Like what sort of results do you think that would produce, and what kind of an impact would that have?
That is a very good question. What could a Truth Commission, or what can TJ produce in the US? I think it can produce acknowledgement, at least by the state. If the general population does not understand, or does not seek to understand, or does not, internalize all of the evidence being brought to them, the state can make apologies, right? Like there has not been a national apology for the scourge of Black enslavement in this country, for the expropriation, that is the theft of native land, for countless abuses against Latinx and Chicanx, many of whom, the border crossed them, right? They did not cross the border. For Asian Americans and discrimination. So there are a lot of things. So I think we focus a lot on what we can do between ourselves. And I think that's very important, right? Like interpersonal, intercultural, social, communal understanding, learning, reconciliation is all really important. But we don't need to wait for people to be ready for it, to be doing teas. The state can provide apologies. The state can provide reparations, restitution. We can talk about reparations in a lot of different ways. There are symbolic reparations, right? So taking down statues, putting up memorials, like scholarship funds for maybe people who have been harmed, injured because of police brutality, like healthcare for the rest of their lives can be reparations, a prosthesis can be reparations, psychological like counseling. Like I was joking with my friend the other day, like who do I get to like charge for, you know, my therapy bill for like this whole like last period of American history, being like a Black American, you know, originally from Zimbabwe, but, you know, being a Black person in the US, you know, dealing with all this while trying to, you know, be a professional and do my job and live my life and all those things, right? So there are lots of things that the state can do. And then maybe people can come along as they start to see policies that reflect a norm and an acceptance of the norm of restitution for harm. You better believe in 95, when the Truth Commission started, that, you know, a lot of Afrikaners were not ready for that. They were not interested in that, but they were confronted with it daily, 4 hours every day. Truth Commission hearings were on the radio. Every Sunday night was the Truth Commission report, where right in your living room, you would see hearings of people confessing to some of the most heinous abuses that one can commit, and also people talking about what had happened to them. That power of communication and speaking from one's experience, right? And that can, you know, assist in the developing of understanding and of empathy, right? Of like academics giving lectures about, you know, race in the US can only do so much, but to hear it directly from people who have experienced harm and who have been on the offending side of that harm, I think that can be extremely powerful. I think that's what TJ can do for us. But again, it is an obligation of countries, right? And we could break that down to states, cities, et cetera, counties, to provide transitional justice. And so we don't have to wait for, prototypical person who does not believe in systemic racism, right? Like our policymakers should start and kind of bring the country along. And what we see in South Africa, for example, it's not quite, the like rainbow nation that, it was made to be when it exited apartheid. Definitely systemic racism still, land, health, economic inequalities, et cetera. But one thing that it was able to do is that for people, James Gibson, a scholar at Washington University in St. Louis, he wrote this book called Overcoming Apartheid. Actually, it's a trilogy: Overcoming Apartheid, Overcoming Intolerance, and Overcoming Historical Land Injustice, I think. So you should read them all. They're fantastic. But in one of them, in Overcoming Apartheid, he surveyed South Africans in 1996, so as the commission was ongoing, and then again in 2001, to basically see, can truth be tied with reconciliation, right? And so he does these surveys in 96 and 2001, and basically a big chunk of it is studying, do people who understand what happened? So essentially, do people who score high on an understanding of what the Truth Commission's like main results were, are they more likely to be reconciled? And he found that yes, so people who understand that apartheid was a non-democratic system predicated on, anti-Black violence, that, these types of abuses happened, and that yes, there was violence on both sides, but of course it was the white minority government that was principally responsible for abuses. So kind of on these dimensions, people who agreed or understood that this is what apartheid was and these were the consequences, they were more likely to be reconciled. And he operationalizes reconciliation 4 different ways. So there is racial reconciliation. So basically, having more favorable views or viewing as equal people from different racial groups than you. Then there was political tolerance, right? So are you able to tolerate people? That means to support the civil and political rights and very importantly, speech and access to the franchise of the least liked group, right? And then also support for human rights, and then support for like institutional reforms. And so that's what the process produced there, that people who, learned from the process were more likely to move themselves, Black and white, and and mixed towards, as they better understood themselves and each other, they were more likely to be reconciled, more likely to be politically tolerant, which is very important for democracy, right? When we want to withhold rights or access to speech, to the press, to voting for groups that we do not like, that is anti-democratic, and then to supporting various initiatives for human rights and institutional reforms per the fourth pillar of TG. So I think that's what these processes can produce. I have great faith, but I also am a political scientist, and so I acknowledge that these are political processes, and they can be hijacked, or they can underdeliver, or they can be framed as more of a success than they actually are, which is something, another conversation for another day about South Africa. It's not your grandma's Truth and Reconciliation story, the way that it was formed. That was a political project, but in many ways it didn't achieve what scholars and, publics think it did. And Black South Africans will tell you that today.
Yeah, for sure. Do you have time for a couple more questions, Kelly?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So like I mentioned, Archibald and Carissa, your questions kind of go together. Archibald, do you have a good connection? I know sometimes you have difficulty with the Wi-Fi. If not, I'm happy to read it, summarize your question. I'll tell you what, Carissa, why don't you ask your question? And Kelly, if you look in the chat, you can see Archibald's question as well. But it's very complimentary to what Carissa's going to ask.
Yes, thank you for being here. It was a fantastic talk. I really enjoyed it. And you spoke mostly about, you already answered the majority of what I was going to ask with Noah's question. But I was wondering specifically if you could speak a little bit more on the effectiveness of city level and state level truth commissions when compared to national truth commissions, because much like Noah, when thinking about what that would look like here in the United States, the states, the 50 states themselves are so distinct, and people have experienced traumas in so many different ways. Just in terms of effectiveness, I was curious to hear your thoughts on what would be the most effective, route for the United States to take.
Yeah.
And just to say that Archibald did text me or chat me to say his microphone isn't working right now. But I think really Carissa's question really is essentially yours, Archibald. I'm looking at it now. But essentially, are federal truth commissions better because they more systematically investigate nationwide solutions, or is it better to work at a city, state level? So very much as Carissa was asking as well.
Yeah, so let's tie the two together. All right. So I said again that transitional justice is something that the state, and when I say the state, I mean countries, right? In international relations, the state is supposed to provide under international law. There could be a deal that we strike that the U.S. will investigate abuses that the federal government is responsible for, right? So let's say the humanitarian crisis at the southern border, the U.S. takes responsibility, that there's a national inquiry into that, or there's a national inquiry, or we already had one about relocation in terms of persons of Japanese ancestry, but that may be for things that were executed on behalf of the nation, in service to the nation, that there's a national level inquiry, and then maybe we start, kind of delegating or devolving powers, having devolution of powers to the states and to cities, as we do have a federal system, right? So then California, things that have been done in the state's name, the highway patrol, the different government bodies, the different policing forces, et cetera, could then be responsible for some things that are that were done at the level of the state, on behalf of the state, by state agents, and then at the city level. So we can kind of see this cone that goes down to the city level. Now, in terms of effectiveness, we don't know. We don't know because we haven't studied subnational implementation of transitional justice. This is, I think, will be the next frontier of this type of research. So you saw, or I shared with you what I'm trying to do, right, is to understand why we have TJ in some countries and not in others, why mechanisms are designed to succeed in some places but not in others, and why in some places there is actually follow-up on these bodies and a long-term positive legacy, right? Things that support human rights, democracy, and the durability of peace. There are many data sets on transitional justice, quantitative transitional justice data sets, that do not capture the U.S. Commission, right? And that was a national commission. So it fit the definition all the ways, right? But was overlooked, which is why with my team, it was very important that I didn't care what the name was called. It did not have to have truth in it. I mean, the famous Guatemalan Truth Commission, it was called the Historical Clarification Commission, la Comisión para Esclarecimiento Histórico, right? Or the Comisión Nacional sobre la Desaparición de Personas in Argentina, CONADEP, right? So I just wanted anybody that is a temporary body created by a national government to investigate events in the past, to establish a pattern of abuse, all while engaging with the affected population. So I think we just need to be counting more. So that was counting in an international context, right? Where we expect them, right? And so what I'm doing now with one of my research fellows in the International Justice Lab, which we just celebrated our first anniversary. It's been a crazy year. We're actually tracking where there have been commissions in the US, because you ask, a human rights scholar on the street somewhere in the US, or even a transitional justice scholar, and they will not be able to tell you a comprehensive list. And so that's what I am trying to do to figure out where they have been, what their mandate was, what they were tasked with doing, what powers they were afforded, what they were able to find, and any results from that process. And so we have over just this semester, it's a very new inquiry, established that there have been commissions in city level commissions in Tulsa, in Mississippi, in so many different places. And so we're trying to count so we can see what they did and if they met their mandates, and in that way kind of assess their effectiveness, and then have them be a model for how this can be done in other parts of the country, right? How do commissions that are engaging anti-Black violence operate, and what do they focus on, what do they find relative to commissions investigating violence against Indigenous persons, for example. And so we are, this is, not even hot off the press. We're still in the weeds to essentially count, to figure out, to define the universe of cases, and then to study them. So hopefully we will move on that quickly, because there have been so many calls for similar such efforts, and as academics, as engaged scholars who want to engage theory and practice, and to have our research be in service of policy and to have these broader impacts, it's important to be able to lend our expertise when we can. And so that's why I consulted on the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission last year as it was being developed. And then similarly, I was at the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocity with a group of scholars, about 10 of us, trying to understand, or for the Auschwitz Institute and DFID, so the British Development Agency, how truth commissions can reduce or can decrease the likelihood of atrocities, specifically by decreasing certain risk factors, like a lack of interpersonal, intercultural, intergroup understanding that so often has led to dehumanization and violence.
I wanted to say, someone just sent me a private note saying, I don't think my brain could ever hold as much knowledge. What a great talking point. And I agree, that is one heck of a lot of knowledge. Lena, I think we might need to make this the last question, even though there's some other wonderful questions here. But maybe, Lena, could you ask what might be the last question for the session? I don't see Lena. Is Lena still there? If not, we can go on to somebody else's question, which is maybe Zulema, if you want to finish things up for us.
Okay, so I read one of your articles that's related to race in the IR field, and you talked about how the topic of race is so central to the IR field, and this idea of race and racism does IR isn't really people don't really want to talk about it, but here in the United States, this idea is very sensitive. And if we want to set a truth commission in the United States, how would we go around about it if right now racism is so sensitive right now?
Okay. So thanks for reading the article. That was another thing that I was up to this summer with my colleague Meredith Loken. And so we talk about how mainstream IR does not take race and racism seriously, but there is a lot of very interesting and really exceedingly well done research in critical IR. So there is critical race IR, there is feminist IR, there is queer IR, and so lots of different ways for rethinking the state system and power and what states and non-state actors do with it and should do with it, et cetera. But the subject of race definitely is a tricky one for some people. And you won't be surprised to hear my answer. I mean, I'm a transitional justice scholar. So for me, I'm like, let's just talk it out. It's a difficult topic, but discomfort is often an indicator of a need, right? And so if it's difficult to talk about, it means that it has not been talked about. It means that there are issues that must be addressed and so must be addressed. And I think that academics are uniquely positioned to start having these conversations because our jobs are reading, talking, and writing. So I think we really should do that. And I've been really encouraged just in terms of response to that particular piece, that article is now on syllabi at more than 80 universities in 15 countries around the world, right? And so I think people, because they are paying more attention now, and because there is pressure from students, for example, we had, quite a powerful position statement from our Black students here at William & Mary, and really, compelling us to address these issues more, that I think we can make quite substantial progress. I mean, even at USC, where I'm a grad student, we formed a BIPOC alliance this year, the students there, and we, had our manifesto and our set of demands, and quite a few of them have been met. So for example, despite the hiring freeze at USC right now, we have been authorized by the dean to have a tenure track assistant professor job search in Black politics or in Indigenous politics. And that was pressure from students at the undergraduate level, at the graduate level, making demands of our universities and our colleges to move on progress because it matters. And I think this is a really great, and this is an opportune time to be articulating both grievances but also demands, and to be having these constructive conversations to tie everything with a bow. There are colleges and universities in the US and other places, but I'm familiar with the US cases, that are undertaking projects that resemble, in many ways, truth commissions. So here at William & Mary, we have a project called the Lemon Project, which is a collaboration by faculty and students in different disciplines to investigate, and this was something that was charged by the university, to investigate the, nearly this is 327, 693, yeah. So more than three century long relationship between William & Mary and people of color in this region, including Black Americans, so enslaved Africans who, were brought here before the U.S. was even a country, right? And who helped to build this institution to what it is. Also in terms of First Peoples, Native Americans, we are on the land that of the Powhatan, where our college is right now, and specifically the Paspahegh tributaries of the Powhatan. And so having schools, investigate this, professors and students and staff, administrators, engage in the history of the institution so that we can engage the fact that, yes, we are on, our institution would not exist were it not for all of these diverse communities contributing, and in many instances not voluntarily, right? So we are on land that was stolen and that was built by enslaved people, right? We need to engage that history and to also trace how it links to the present day. And I'll just close with this. because I've been thinking about my dad a lot lately. My dad graduated from UCLA as a foreign student from Zimbabwe in 1963. It was not until 1967, so he was already in grad school at this point, 1967, that the first African-American students in residence began here at William & Mary. So it's kind of, so I talk to my students about this, these are the important conversations, that it's kind of wild that, I teach at an institution where my father, not my grandfather, my great-grandfather, and my father could not have been a student in residence at the time that he was in college. And so I encourage colleges and universities and for students to push on departments and professors and administrators for their own institutions to engage their own histories and to devise different ways of restitution. So Georgetown is a leader in this, not the best necessarily, but certainly the first. And so they've offered, for example, legacy status to all applicants who can connect their heritage to the persons that were the enslaved persons that Georgetown sold when it was going to go under. And so that's one thing. I think it should be more like full rides for all of those descendants, things like that. But we are starting to see kind of, germination of ideas, forms of restitution for institutional harm and institutional violence. And just because, we're not having, battle-related deaths, on the quad does not mean that institutions are perfect, and does not mean that they do not perpetuate, racism and white supremacy and sexism, et cetera. And so we should be having these conversations, engaging with the history, connecting it to the present, and developing a plan for the future.
Great. Well, let me close things off here with just a few things. One, in the chat, Professor Ear has posted some really terrific links, so check out the chat for those connected to the talk. There's also some excellent questions that we didn't really have time for, but it's worth checking out those questions just to get a sense of what's on everyone's mind and things to discuss in another section. Secondly, I guess I'd just say that sometimes you bring in guests and it's better, sometimes it's worse, but this was fabulous. So thanks so much, Kelly. So just join me in thanking Kelly for her visit. That was just really an extraordinary session. So really appreciate your presence here.